Hi friends, this is Vedic Astrological Outlook Part 2 for 2020-2021, continuing on from Part 1, the earlier video. The lunar year, as calculated according to Vedic astrology, begins when the Sun and Moon are in an exact conjunction in the sign of Pisces. And that happens to be around springtime currently. So I won't explain the technicality of that. Suffice it to say that begins the lunar year, which this year was March 24th of 2020. It extends until April 11th of 2021. So what happens within that time frame beginning on March 24th? Perhaps it began before, but doesn't matter. This is officially the time frame that we're looking at. Will have an effect within that time frame, that year. So that's essentially what I'm saying. In this case, it's a little longer than 12 months. Jupiter, not only were Jupiter and Saturn together at that time, but Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and Pluto were together at that time. And the four of those planets were in an orb, enclosed in an orb of 5 to 6 degrees. They were all that close together. So this does not bode well, especially for our friend Jupiter, who is the only benefic or benevolent planet among those four. Saturn, Mars, and Pluto are considered to be malefics or malevolent planets by nature. So Jupiter is in a group with the schoolyard bullies. Jupiter by nature is expansive. He brings growth. He brings evolution. You know, things grow, people get better, things they evolve over time. That's the nature of Jupiter. And that can have the same effect on the economy. Why? Because Jupiter represents economy, wealth, income, finances, investments, banking, anything to do with money. Saturn, on the other hand, is not an expansive planet. He is a contractive influence. There's only two forces in the universe, my friends: expansion, contraction. If you don't believe me, watch your lungs. So Saturn tends to contract. So what's he going to do to Jupiter, especially if Jupiter goes into the sign of Capricorn, where he's debilitated, as I explained, in a very weak position, as I explained in the last video, in a very weak position. This is going to cause him to contract more. So we can expect in this year a financial reversal, an economic slowdown, or an economic crash. Guess what? It's not a surprise at this point in time. I discussed this with some of my clients at the latter part of last year. I did not do a video on it for whatever reason, but I thought there would be a financial reversal either this year or perhaps next year, but obviously it's this year. And the result or the cause of it is obvious. It's this coronavirus. And all these people, I mean millions of people, are out of work. To me, that's the real tragedy here. God bless the people who are losing their lives, sincerely. But millions of people out of work, not able to make a living, which they normally would do. It's not good. Okay, so I did predict the financial crash back in 2008, 2009. I thought we'd have another one maybe just a few short years ago. Didn't happen. I asked some of my banking friends who work in banks in Zurich, in London, in New York. I said, what's going on? There should have been a correction by now. They said, yeah, there should have been, but they staved it off. Economic easing, or they just swept it under the rug. So what have they done in the past 10 years? What have they changed? How have they changed the financial system? Where's the evidence of the lessons we learned because of the financial crash in '08 and '09? I don't see any evidence. Do you? Well, guess what, my friends? Time to pay the piper. As I said in the last video, this is time where there's going to be fundamental change. There's going to be change at a deep level. Even an old stalwart, a pillar of the financial establishment, the Financial Times, the 150-year-old newspaper, has said, quote, "Radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table." Well, even the Financial Times is wake up and smelling the coffee. Okay, so let's look at the history. Right now, I'm going to continue talking about Jupiter and Saturn. Then I'll go through the different ones, different combinations among those 4. So historically, with the Jupiter-Saturn combination, in World War II, we had Germany invading Russia. Also, approximately at that time, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which is a satellite of USA. They call it a state, call it what you want. They attacked. Now, this is also very interesting. There's very strong indications of the death of a ruler, a political leader, like a king, a queen, a politician, a president, a prime minister, somebody like that, that will be a result of this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So before we jump into the present or future, let's look at the past. In 1840, William Henry Harrison, who was elected president of the U.S., died in office of pneumonia. It was a Jupiter-Saturn in Scorpio conjunction. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, I think it was his second term, was assassinated. Well, obviously it was, was assassinated with Jupiter, Saturn in Leo. In 1881, when James Garfield took office, so it wasn't at the time of the election, but the time of when he took office, he too was assassinated in office. With Jupiter and Saturn in 2 different signs, but they were 5 degrees apart. Again, a very small orb of influence. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was president, and he died of food poisoning in office with Jupiter, Saturn in Leo. And then in 1960, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Jupiter, Saturn were in Sagittarius. So these are all examples of a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction wherein a president of the U.S. either died or was assassinated in office. So if we just go right to the chart, the astrology chart, the Vedic astrology chart for the U.S. presidential inauguration. I'm not predicting any winner of the presidential election yet. I'll deal with that at a separate time. Those of you who know me know that I have predicted since 1980 all of the presidential elections correctly. I predicted the winners. Not doing that today. So the U.S. presidential inauguration will take place on January 20th of 2021 and at 12 noon. So he'll be sworn into office. So from that time forward, he's president. In that chart, in the 10th house, which is the house of the leader, the government, the authority, but it is the house of the leader. What do we have in Capricorn? We have Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Sun, Mercury. We have 5 planets there, my friends. That's a lot. And we have what we've been talking about, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto also there. The chance of a president, the next U.S. president, beginning in 2021, dying in office or being assassinated is very, very strong. On the ascendant of that same chart, we have an Aries ascendant, which has Moon and Mars and Uranus in Aries, which further throws shadow on this chart, the chart of the president, and not necessarily his entire presidency, because there are some strengths here as well, which I'm not going to get into right at this moment, perhaps another time. So, now let us look at continuing in this year. From May 14th, 2020 until September 13th, on the one hand, we're going to have Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, and Venus in the sky going into retrograde or backward motion. When these planets go into backward motion, it creates more difficulty, more intense situations, reversals, problems, exacerbated problems. I'm not trying to predict them all. We'll go through the rest of these conjunctions and you'll see what I'm talking about. But if you want to write down dates, write down May 14th till September 13th as a time to watch out for some significant difficulties in our world or events taking place. Saturn will remain retrograde until September 29th. Jupiter until September 13th. Saturn until September 29th. So you can virtually say from May 14th to the end of September, it doesn't look good. Now, we have, as I mentioned, an exact conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, again on winter solstice, December 21st of 2020. Jupiter represents kings, queens, political leaders, and constitutional governments. Saturn represents governments, rulers, democracies, and dictators, and also the death of the ruler. So we're talking about that. We're seeing influences along those lines. Again, I won't talk about Trump and Biden at this time. Now let's look at the Mars-Jupiter conjunction that was in effect on March 24th last month when the lunar yearly chart began. What can this bring? This can bring adverse effects to the economy. Excuse me for repeating myself. The government can indulge in unnecessary or unexpected expenditure. We're not only talking about the U.S. here, by the way. I'm using the U.S. for obvious reasons as an example, because a lot of times what happens with the U.S., it affects a lot of countries. But I'm not talking about the U.S. I'm talking about the world and various countries with varying leaders. So unnecessary, unexpected expenditure, well, we have that right now, my friends. You know, a lot of people are being paid money who are out of work just to survive. So we're going into massive debt in various countries for that alone because of the virus. Jupiter-Mars conjunction indicates political instability. It says that the members of the cabinet, legislature, Congress, etc., or the ruler himself may meet with accidents or death. Then we have the Mars-Saturn conjunction, which is a particularly vicious conjunction. Again, began last month, March 24th. What does this bring? What can it bring? Riots, strife, rebellions, conflicts with the police, military, and intelligence services. Those are the ones you don't know about, the intelligence services. It can bring civil strife, murders, looting, arson, even war. That's right, my friends, even war. It can bring, Mars-Saturn conjunction can bring national calamities such as pandemics, earthquakes, floods, storms. So that Mars-Saturn conjunction probably had a lot to do with the pandemic. As you may have seen in my earlier video on coronavirus, I did mention Rahu is transiting the constellation of Ardra and Ketu the constellation of Mula. I did some further research on that. I found that Ardra specifically represents the lungs, the bronchial system, and it brings diseases such as asthma and bronchitis and pneumonia. And what we know is that with the COVID-19 virus, people get the flu, and that flu infects their lungs get congested, and it turns into pneumonia, and they perish from that. So please remember, I had told you April 22nd this month, Rahu will exit Ardra. Maybe things get better, and some of these restrictions that we're under with the lockdowns in the various countries will be lifted. In this country right here, Ireland, they think they've hit their peak, and the new cases are starting to fall in number. Staying with Mars-Saturn, it means high numbers of deaths among the population. That's another no-brainer, my friends. We're looking at it. It also means overthrow or death of the ruler. Well, that's what I've been talking about, death of the ruler. Overthrow of the ruler. Well, that certainly happens in a lot of small countries with unstable governments, as we know. And it can mean simply a change of government. Well, I know my American friends, and believe me, I have thousands of them. I lived in the U.S. almost 30 years, and I still have majority of my clients are still in the U.S., to be honest. Change of government may come as good news and a breath of fresh air to a lot of the people that I've talked to. Okay, the next one, Mars-Pluto conjunction. Mars-Pluto conjunction represents violence and conflict on a vast scale. Well, this means war. We're not talking about the pandemic in this conjunction. We're talking about war or upheaval or rebellion. It could even be a nuclear war. I don't want to say that, but I'm going to say it. Why? Because Pluto represents nuclear energy and nuclear power. In 1939, historically, World War II began with an opposition of Mars and Pluto. We're talking this year of a conjunction of Mars and Pluto right together. Planetary war, a Graha Yuddha. In 1939, they were opposite. And opposition is a push-pull, tension of the opposites. This too will bring the same effect. But when it's a conjunction, it's two people right in front of each other, face to face, who aren't getting along. So this resulted, 1939, began with opposition Mars and Pluto, which resulted in two, not one, but two nuclear attacks on Japan. I hope this is wrong. I hope this does not come to pass. Then we have the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which means huge national expenditure for the benefit of the people. Well, you're looking at it as we speak, which will create further financial and economic problems, which I've covered in some of these other statements. Then we have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Saturn represents democracy and the working class. This may be a time, all things considered, for a huge fundamental shift and change so that the working class, the laborers, the craftspeople, the tradespeople, the carers, the healthcare workers nowadays especially, where these people finally get recognized and get their due. the labor community, which, you know, they're always giving lip service that we're going to do this and that for you. And a lot of times that's found wanting. So when Saturn is as strong as he is, because he's in his own sign in Capricorn, this could mean a fundamental change that helps the regular person. So Pluto represents dictators and dictatorships. Well, that doesn't sound very good, a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Well, if you're overthrowing the status quo, it might be. So historically, what do we have as an example? In 1931, we had an opposition. Not here we have a conjunction, Saturn-Pluto. 1931, we had an opposition, just like I just explained. So tension of the opposites between Saturn and Pluto. It resulted in a Nazi dictator taking control of Germany, known as Adolf Hitler. That's what happened in Germany. It didn't happen in every other country. At that time, it happened in Germany. So what country's on the verge of that? That's how you got to look at that. Some of my friends have made jokes about that in the U.S. that they feel like they're under dictatorship now. And I'm not going to comment on that. Okay, Saturn, Pluto together can also bring war, as I mentioned, about Mars and Pluto. And it can also bring the overthrow or the death of the ruler. We've talked about that. Pluto can bring assassination. Pluto can bring nuclear attack. Saturn, Pluto also brings great damage from natural disasters. Well, a pandemic is a disaster. So we've had a lot of damage, a lot of death from that. Saturn, Pluto can also mean the emergence of new nations. After what? After much bloodshed and even after massacres. Example, 1947. 1947, India gained its independence from Britain. This was brought about by large-scale massacres and communal riots, which gave birth to not only India's independence, to a second country, known now as Pakistan. And many Hindus and Muslims were killed in that fighting. I don't know. I think it was in the millions. I don't know the correct figure. At the same, under the same influence of Saturn and Pluto, in 1948, I believe it was, Israel also declared its independence. Now, for Israel, it was not a conjunction. Again, it was I think it was an opposition, though. Anyway, so what does that have to do with it? Well, Israel has virtually been at war, at least with Palestine, the whole time. So that's what that amounts to. I'm going to end with something more positive, but I'm going to save that for the next video, Part 3, Vedic Astrological Outlook Part 3, when we'll look at some of the positives that all of this may bring about. So thank you for watching, and I hope this has been somewhat enlightening or has helped you understand what is happening and what may happen at this point in time in our world.